We are going to kick off a new short 3-week series this morning, looking at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah from the Old Testament. And if you were around this time last year, we also had a series where we were in these books. And so we're coming back to kind of revisit it. This is our 2.0 this summer. And so some of this might sound familiar. There might be some review. But it was a long time ago, and it's always good to review some things. And I think that with most things in the world, but definitely in our relationship with God, there are always new things to learn and to be revisited, and they're new. We are in different places, and the Spirit of God meets us in different places. I did want to acknowledge this morning, I just felt that it was important to acknowledge the conflict that is going on in current day, the region of Israel, because some of the stuff we're going to talk about today is regarding those same people groups and the same geographical region. And I know that the horrific war that is going on affecting Palestinians and Israelis brings up a lot of things in all of us. And I'm sure we all have different perspectives and emotions and complications with that. But I just realized that some of what I'm talking about might activate some of that stuff because I'm talking about people in this land and about war and about destruction and about rebuilding. And so these things are not related, but what we're talking about today is a historical account of the people of Israel thousands of years ago and how that can connect to us on some themes of rebuilding. But I don't know, this is like a semi-risky thing, so have some grace here. But I just want us to recognize that something I might say, please don't make assumptions or assume. If you have questions about that current day situation, come talk to one of us. But this is separate in some ways, but we can't deny that Jesus was a Jewish person and lived in that region. And for reasons that I don't understand, God chose the people of Israel to bring his awareness and his love to the world. And so that does have that affects us in how we look at what's happening now in all sorts of ways. So with that very awkward and fumbling acknowledgement, I just want to recognize that's happening, and it's horrible, and it's in our faces if you follow the news, if you're on social media. And so today, we are talking about that part of the world, and we're talking about the people of God. So yeah, with that, I'm going to pray. God, I thank you that you are with us this morning, and I thank you that you have things for us to hear, that things that happened thousands of years ago in a place far away, you still have things for us through that. And I do want to take this moment to also pray for the people living in the region of Palestine and Israel, that you would somehow bring resolution to a situation that has caused horrible pain and devastation for thousands of years. And that you somehow would make yourself known to people who are suffering, and that you would work in the powers of this world to bring peace, that people that are being hurt and oppressed would experience freedom in their spirits through you, and actual freedom from oppression. It is a situation that is way too big for us. And so I ask that you would be present with those people right now, and that they would sense your presence as much as we sense it here this morning. Be with us. Help us to hear what you have for us. Amen. So no matter where you are in your journey with Jesus, I would guess that you don't spend a lot of time reading through the historical accounts in the Old Testament. Some of them are kind of interesting. Some of them are quite boring, and they're often very confusing. To be totally honest, there are parts of the Old Testament, large parts of it, that I have a very difficult time reading. I'm either confused, I'm bored, or I'm really angry. Because I don't understand some of the stuff that happens, And if you're just reading along, it's quite shocking. And there have been times in my life where I tried to do the read through the Bible in a year, and I'd get halfway through Genesis and just stop. And then I'd pick up, and then what happened is I kept reading the same parts that were hard for me, because I'd be like, oh, I should try again. And I'm like, wow, there's a lot in here that is difficult to sit with. And I think part of that is because the Bible is confusing. And there is some stuff that just is hard for our human minds to understand and comprehend. And I think part of that also is that growing up, as I did in the United States Christian culture of the 80s and 90s, some things were taught in really unhelpful ways. And I remember being a child that was often taught about stories of the Old Testament with really cool pictures of all the animals on the ark, and Noah inside of a whale with a campfire somehow, he got it, when he got swallowed by the whale. And also being taught that these were people, role models to look up to. So it's be brave like Daniel, and be faithful like Joseph, and be strong like Samson. And then as I got older and I read those stories, I'm I don't want to be like Samson. If you know the story of Samson, he does some stuff. And it is true, the Bible still says that Samson had faith and God used him. So I'm not discounting that. But when you're a child and you color this picture of Samson breaking these pillars super Hercules, and you're whoa, cool, I want to be like Samson. You don't want to be like Samson in most of his things. And so I think that it's hard. Teaching the story of Samson to children is hard. Teaching most of the stories in the Old Testament to children is hard. But I think that we do a disservice, because then I had a lot of dissonance as a teenager, actually reading these stories. And I'm God, these people were complex. And what do I do with the parts of them that seem really wrong? And I was never taught, I was just told to be like them because they're these models. And I think that part of that is that that's just not what we're supposed to do with those stories. Those stories in the Old Testament are not examples of perfect leadership. That's not what it is, but that's often what we do, because we don't understand, or we haven't taken the time to realize that there's different genres in the Bible. There's narrative, there's history, there's allegory, there's wisdom. There's all these different things, but we read it all sometimes like it's the words of Jesus, like it's actual instruction of this is how you should live. And that gets very complicated very quickly. And so as my own personal journey, there's been a lot of I need to look at this a different way. The story of the Old Testament is really about God and about his relationship with people who act like people, right? They're flawed. They're sometimes have really bad intentions. They give in to power, and they give in to all these things because they're people. But the point is not the people. The point is God's relationship with those people and his relentless pursuit of people, even when they fail and they hurt each other and they're flawed. And that, it still bothers me a little bit, because I want there to just be a little footnote and God did not like what Abraham did. It would just make me feel a little better. But it has helped me realize I can read those stories with a different perspective, because I'm not expecting it to be this example of what God wanted or what I'm supposed to seek after. Now, there are still lots of things that we can gain from the stories in the Old Testament. We're going to be talking about it this morning. There's wisdom that can be learned. There's comfort that can be obtained. But I think we often have to do a little more homework than we like to do on understanding the genre. What is this type of literature? Who was it written to? What was the cultural context of the time? And recognizing that that is vastly different in most cases, especially for us right now in 2024 in Orange County. There's a lot of stuff that could get lost in translation. And so hopefully we will do that this morning. So you could ask, why don't we just ignore it then, right? Why do we pay attention to these stories if they're so frustrating and complicated? And I think one of the main reasons is because it mattered to Jesus. And if we are people who are following Jesus, what was important to him does matter to us. Because for Jesus, these were his sacred texts. These were the things that influenced and taught him. These were the stories that were told as he was growing up. These stories instructed Jesus and his contemporaries on how to be faithful to God, and they reminded them of God's faithfulness to them and God's provision. And so it was important for Jesus and the way he looked at the world. So when he's telling stories in the New Testament in our Bibles, there's context and there's references to these things in Jewish history that are important for us to understand. We get a fuller picture of what Jesus is sharing. And then also, these stories are important because Jesus makes it clear that through him, as God coming to earth, the story of the Jewish people becomes the story of anyone who follows him. And so we are part of this story because of our faith in Jesus. We have inherited some of the amazing and encouraging stories, and some of those really difficult stories are now part of our spiritual history and our background. And so understanding that informs some of how we live out our life as Jesus followers, because we are now, in a spiritual sense, part of that history. As I've mentioned a couple of times already, it's important to understand the genre, the type of literature. And so Ezra and Nehemiah, as Nan shared last year, are really one book that tells a unified story. And for different reasons, they've been split up, like in our current English version. But it's a historical account telling the story of the people of Israel who had been exiled and taken into captivity, and Jerusalem and the temple had been destroyed. And it's the story of those people coming back to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So a brief kind of context to get us up to speed. God had given the people of Israel kings because they had wanted kings to rule them. And so God had given them kings. And through a lot of the Old Testament, we're reading the stories of the kingdom of Israel and the two separate kingdoms that became. And there is a lot of prophecy as well, talking to the people of Israel, telling them how to be the people God has called them to be. And as I already told you earlier, they fail, often and in big ways, of being the people that God had called them to be. And so God, through his prophets, told them, if you don't remember the covenant, if you don't follow my commands, if you don't live in a way that brings justice and shalom and peace to the people around you, you are going to be taken captive. And that is what happens. The people of Israel failed to live out the fullness of who God had called them to be. And so God allowed other kingdoms around them to take them into captivity. And this was a way to bring them back. God's heart was to bring them back to him and to bring them back to the ways that he had called them to live. And so we see that because they turned to other gods, they forgot the covenant promises, and they failed to live in a way that was fair and just and loving to those around them. Because they weren't obedient to the ways of God, they were taken into captivity. And they were in captivity in different kingdoms that restricted the ways they could live and eat. And there's lots of stories in the Bible about Daniel and Esther and all these people that are living in that captivity. And the story of Ezra and Nehemiah is happening chronologically at the end of what we understand as the Old Testament. And it is the story where the kings of those foreign nations give them permission and actually support them to go back and rebuild their temple and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so in this story that we're talking about this morning and the next couple weeks, it's the story of the people of Israel going back to rebuild what had been destroyed. So when they were taken captive, they didn't just go in nicely and put them in chariots and take them away. They burned the temple, they burned the city walls, they destroyed Jerusalem. And so this was a big moment where these people are being given the opportunity and actually the financial and material support to go back and build the temple. But what we read in Ezra and Nehemiah is a messy story of success and failure, just like the rest of the arc of humanity. There are people that go back with excitement and they rebuild the temple and they consecrate themselves back to God and they're building the wall together. But it doesn't all just go in this nice linear fairy tale way. There are failures that they do along the way. They face opposition from those around them. They face mockery. There's some actually kind of comical, because I don't understand the context, like stories about like their wall is so flimsy, the fox is going to run over it and it's all going to fall down. You know, like that was like these, and Nehemiah is like, we need to kill them because they're being mean to us. You know, that's my interpretation. And so, but they were being lots of opposition around them, and they failed to stay faithful. They said, yes, of course we're going to follow the laws, and then like right away they stopped following the laws of God. And so this story is a huge encouragement. Like the people of God are going back to rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem, but it's not just like this arc up of wonderful following God and everything works out. There's lots of ups and downs of their own failures, of the opposition around them. And I think this is a really accurate picture of the world and of life and of the Christian journey. The temple and Jerusalem represented God's presence with them. It was the place where God told them to build this so that I will come and be with you. And so it was a big deal to have that destroyed, and it was a big deal to be able to rebuild that. And Nehemiah and Ezra and the people that went back with them, they had this extreme reverence for God and for what God had built originally and what he was calling them to do again. They had a heart to follow after God and what was important. But even with that, and even with people that were excited to go back and work hard to rebuild the wall, it didn't happen the way it was supposed to. And this points to the fact that that couldn't happen until Jesus came. Even this was pointing to the fact that you can have the right intentions and try to rebuild this temple, but that presence of God being restored isn't going to fully be realized until Jesus comes in the flesh as God to meet with the people in a way that the temple never could. As we look at this story of rebuilding and kind of start to turn to how this can be relevant and parallel to our own lives, I think we see around us that the destruction of our foundation and our faith and this place that we view and see God can be shaken or destroyed. And for many of us, that has happened at times. If it was a church community, if it was a family, if it was a specific leader, there can be things that shake the very foundation of how we relate to God and where we see as that place where we can meet with God. And that can happen because of our own actions. That can happen because of people that lived before us. Some of the people that went back to rebuild Jerusalem, they were born in captivity. They didn't disobey God in that sense. They were born in this reality, but they were still living under the consequences of what the generations before them had done. And so sometimes these things that shake us can happen because of other people. It can be the choices we make. And so I think that we need to look at how that impacted them. And then what does the rebuilding process look like? When they went back, they were the kings of that time actually gave them the same things that were taken from the temple. It had been like stored. And there's a whole list of like, there were 30 gold bowls. There were 18 basins. So these things were actually given back to them to take back to the temple. And so sometimes I think that those things from our past understandings or our past experiences are important to keep with us as we rebuild. There are elements of that can be really important. But often, the ways that our foundations were shaken or the things that happened, we need to make really big changes into how we're going to rebuild and what that looks like. And I think it's very comforting to me that in the Bible, in real life, there were like 400 years, but pretty quickly after this story, you get to Jesus, and then the story really changes, right? But we have obviously a very different situation because we are living in a time where the Holy Spirit is available to us. Jesus promises to be with us through him in a different way. And so I think as I look at times in my life where I feel like there was rebuilding that needed to happen, it's become very clear to me that what came before that need for rebuilding was that I lost sight of what really mattered. And Jay led, when Jay and Ari and Meg were singing this morning, that there was a song where, there's a refrain that says it's so much better your way. And Jay mentioned us like coming back to Jesus as our center. And I think just like the people of Israel, we often get caught up and our faith is built on things that are not actually Jesus. Or our faith is shaken by things that aren't actually related to Jesus. And there are church cultures and church communities that we have experienced harm or hurt from because I think often they weren't really based in the truth of who Jesus was. And obviously I support church, like we're all here, right? But we are going to fail each other. We are not going to live up to this standard of what Jesus really wants and what it means to be human. And so we need each other. Like it has to be about people, but it can't be about the people because we are all going to do something that could cause us to question that foundation or could lead us to need to rebuild our faith in some way. And so I would encourage us to reflect because I know for a lot of us, churches have been a place where hurt has happened or pain has been experienced or we have been taught about God in a way that is not accurate and true. And so there has been rebuilding that has happened or there is rebuilding that needs to happen. And I think also that not just in the church sense, but that as humans, there is often the need to rebuild from some event, from some life circumstance. And this is probably the more relevant kind of parallel for me that part of my 80s, 90s Southern California Christian growing up was this idea that somehow like it all just works out. Like you follow God and everything will be fine. And it's not for me, it wasn't a monetary prosperity gospel. It wasn't like you'll be rich, but it was like everything will work out. If you follow God, he'll protect you and everything will be fine. And I wouldn't have to get very far in this room to hear stories of times where things were not fine or things are not fine. And I'm not just talking about Ukraine or Palestine, but in our own lives, right? In our own bodies, in our own families. And I have also, just like I've had to rethink the way I read the Old Testament, I've had to rethink what it means to follow God and experience him. And a lot of my little micro rebuildings are dealing with disappointments and expectations where I thought, wait, this is what I was told God's promises mean. And I did all the things and I lived in the way and like life still happens. And that seems very unfair and that seems wrong. And that has caused these little mini earthquakes in my relationship with God to say, well, who is God then? How can he be good if these good things didn't happen to me and I was told that they would if I followed him in this way? And so for me in this current place in my life, a lot of my rebuilding is orienting and reorienting my understanding of who God is to who he says he is. And a struggle for me is that I want the world to be just and right and fair in the way I want it to be. And I want that for me, but I also want it for the people around me. And that's not the case. Life is not fair. Life is not good. There is pain. And so what then do I do? What is my faith built on with that reality? And it was maybe a month or so ago in church where I was really struck. And it was actually one of those Sundays where we were told to like share really personal prayer things with people. And some people had like a hard time with that. But for me, I still remember this distinct moment of like, God's goodness is God. Like his presence is his goodness. God is good. And so if the things don't look good to me or don't feel good to me, there's still 100% room and need to lament those things and be real about it. But that doesn't mean that God is not who he says he is, because he gets to dictate that, and not in a weird, punishing obedience way. But I think that in my life and living most of my life in the US, there's this expectation that things are going to be okay and that comfort is going to happen. We're going to have what we need. And I had the privilege in living in a different part of the world for about a year and a half, and they just don't have that expectation. They don't have it's not privilege, but they don't even have the ability to expect that everything will work out, because their baseline is nothing, like life is hard. That's their baseline. And I was privileged enough to grow up in a family and a community where life was pretty good. And I have just realized so much that the way we look at God and the way that we feel like things should work, it's influenced by so many different things. And when we have a posture that is more readily able to handle and respond to the pain and the confusion that is in life, I feel like our foundations will be shaken much less, because we expect pain. And Jesus said it. If we look at Jesus, he did not say, go follow me and everyone will love you and respect you and everything will be great. He said, people are going to persecute you. They're going to hate you like they hated me. In this world, you will have trouble. Like that's what we got, right? But God is present with us in it. And I think for any of us in this room, we would not say, like, that's not true. Life is not trouble. It's like wonderful. There are wonderful moments. There is joy. But life is hard. And God gives us a whole book to read about how hard life is and the propensities of people. And God comes into that and relentlessly pursues his people and gives them the ultimate rebuilding through Jesus that allows us to hold on to a foundation that will not be shaken because of who he is. And it's one of the things of our church that I appreciate so much, because it's not the way I grew up, is that we are right there to lament when it happens. We do not run away from the lament. And we are still here Sunday after Sunday, encouraging each other in this way of Jesus, but we are not pretending that there aren't things to lament. And we aren't pretending that expectations, that we've been disappointed and that things are confusing. And I think that as we see this heart in Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the temple and return to what God had for them, we have that ability right in front of us to come back. And when things around us shake that, when the world and people professing Jesus don't match with what we see of Jesus, I really encourage us to keep coming back to who he is and the reality of what life is and what he has given us the understanding of that. There's a community, a faith community that I'm very connected with, and they are going through like the textbook worst church scenario where things are just falling apart. And I spoke over the weekend. I was with an older woman in the church who's like another mother figure for me, who has experienced a lot of pain in this last year. And her perspective was so heartening for me, because this is where her heart was, is like, this is life. And Jesus called us to this, and we have the privilege of walking in hard times with Jesus to show the world around us who he is, and to have a different response to the pain and the accusations and the hardship. We can respond in a way that is different, that shows the love of God to others. And so for me, and in that I've shared a little bit of my own journey, it was so meaningful for me to be reminded that often the story we tell of Jesus and the message that we proclaim to try to get people to accept him is this shallow, commercialized, Jesus will make your life better message. But the message of Jesus is so much truer and deeper, because Jesus will revolutionize our lives, and he will change us, and there is comfort, and there is goodness, and there is provision, but it's in such a more complex and layered way. And so as we close this morning, I wanted to just share a spiritual practice that has really helped me as I'm in these times of feeling like things fell apart and I want to rebuild and I want to go back. And for me, which just happens to be our rhythm of where our church is right now, is this practice of reflection. And for me, it often involves retreat from people, from phones. For me, it goes into nature somewhere. And it is a regular practice to try to reorient myself to what I know is true. Because I am someone who will get involved in all the things around me and try to make sense of it all and make it all change and fix it all. And I want to act. I want to do things when I start to get stressed or overwhelmed. I want to act. Partly because I just want to avoid the feelings, so I'm going to do stuff. And so this regular reflection of retreating and resting and reflecting and letting God meet me allows me to have the perspective to go back into the fray of the world in a grounded sense. And that is part of me allowing God to rebuild for me through rest and reflection. So I encourage you all, and I recognize that as a single person without children, it is much easier for me because I can just be like, I'm going to the beach, see ya, and I go. And I know that for a lot of you, it's harder when you have children to care for or you have a spouse who you need to accommodate for their schedule and their needs. But I believe it is worth the effort, and it is possible to go to the Fullerton Arboretum or take a couple hours to drive down to the beach or go to a coffee shop, or I know some people don't like nature, so if you don't want to be outside, there are ways to find air-conditioned places where you can go hang out. But to make reflection a priority, because our world is so busy and so in our faces or in our hands all the time that it can be easy to avoid that. But I think part of us living in the fullness of who God has called us to and understanding how to rebuild after hard times or after things have shattered, we need to be still. And we need to let the Holy Spirit meet us in ways that we otherwise would not if we don't quiet ourselves. So as we wrap up this morning, we're just going to have a little bit of quiet music just for a couple minutes, and then Elliot's going to come up and lead us in the end of our service. But take a few minutes right now to reflect and to just see if God has one thing to share with you. And I know it's, at least up here, it's a little warm. I don't know how it is back there, so try to, stay awake if you can. But let God meet you in just a few minutes of reflection. God, I thank you so much that your Spirit is present with us and that you have given us a true and accurate picture through the story of your people, of the realities of life, that you do not shy away from what is real and what is true. And help us to seek you and find you as we sit with the realities of our own life and of the things that have been broken and destroyed. Help us to find our foundation in you, that you would show us what it means to rebuild those things. Amen.